Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this wonderful world of ours. I hope you're safe, healthy, happy, and for as many of you as possible, still on vacay. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of conversations on issues of real consequence to America and to the world. I'm not quite sure where to begin this morning. I've had a fair amount of experience in my professional life with negotiations and even with summits. And while the Middle East and what's happening in Russia, Ukraine are fundamentally different, in my telling, there are usually 3 or 4 ingredients that would make not just a successful summit, but a successful agreement. First would be 2 leaders who are willing and able to negotiate seriously. Second would be a mediator who has a strategy and is prepared to use what I call honey and vinegar in order to press both sides, honey being incentives, vinegar being disincentives. Third, enough pain and gain to bring them to the table and to keep them there. And finally, an end state, a goal that would meet the core requirements of each side and allow them to walk away with feeling an explanation for themselves. Every leader needs an explanation for him or herself, and an explanation to their constituencies that this has been a success. Frankly, I don't see any of these 4 ingredients at play right now. And yet, at the same time, we have a rather extraordinary situation where an American president threw himself into a process which has now not only resulted in a meeting with Vladimir Putin, but an extraordinary scene yesterday in Washington. Where this goes, is there a strategy? I frankly, I will plead confusion. But I may be confused, but we happen to have today 2 of the most extraordinary analysts to Russia and Ukraine and negotiations on the planet to try to unpack this sort of confusion and create some clarity. I'll briefly introduce them, but I'm sure you all know them by reputation. Andrew Weiss, that's Weiss, is the James Family Chair and Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment, where he oversees research on Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. His graphic novel biography, which I would recommend, of Vladimir Putin, Accidental Tsar, The Life and Lies of Vladimir Putin, was published by First Second Macmillan in 2022. Eric Ciaramella is a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at Carnegie. His work focuses on Russia and Ukraine, and Eric has had an extraordinary career and great experience. Andrew is well in government. Eric has held positions in the National Intelligence Council, the National Security Council, and CIA. So let me just begin with a where are we, Andrew? Let me start with you. What happened in Anchorage on Friday?
Hey, sorry. Thanks for having me on, Aaron, and thanks for the kind words at the beginning. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I wish I could give you a bumper sticker assessment of Friday without sort of putting this in a bigger frame. And the bigger frame is that Donald Trump has been trying to kind of put Ukraine on the back burner and sort of get on to some bigger reconciliation or relaunch of the U.S.-Russia relationship. And he's been trying to do that since he became a candidate for president in 2016. And at every turn, he tries to overcorrect or try to simplify U.S.-Russia relations and then just kind of get on with it. And the reason for that has never been well defined either by him or members of his administration. And I think Alaska's, the only most recent manifestation of that effort. And every single time Donald Trump tries to say, let's just get this thing behind us, let's solve the Ukraine problem, he keeps being hit upside the head by reality, which is that this is a major point of departure in Russia's relationship with the outside world to launch a war of aggression of this scale, and ending it is not something that's really in the hands of the United States president, unless he's willing to throw Ukraine under the bus. And in Alaska, there seems to have been yet another attempt by the Russians to say this could all be over really quickly if Ukraine would just surrender, either surrender territory or agree to give up its sovereignty and become, once again, essentially an appendage of Russia. And since that's not really easy for Ukraine to sign off on without, or Ukraine's leaders to sign off on unless they wanted to commit political suicide, it was yet again one of these moments of sort of false overpromising by the president and his team. So they seem in Alaska to have heard a couple things from Vladimir Putin that upon close scrutiny just don't check out. One, this is not a war about territory. And if it was just about where you draw the line of control in eastern Ukraine, this war probably could have been resolved some time ago. Two, the terms of what the US side was portraying as a big Russian concession by allowing, in the phrasing that Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff used on the Sunday shows, that there's now some new opening for a security guarantee by the United States. Upon closer scrutiny, that's just not there as well. And then lastly, the president seems to think that this is a crisis that could be resolved simply by putting people in a room, either putting himself in the room or putting Putin and Zelenskyy in a room. And that, is, again, there is no sort of shortcut here. And, this is not a situation based on the parameters you described that is going to lend itself to some urgent, sort of immediate emergency set of convenings and being resolved quickly.
So Alaska was a moment? Was it a headline or was it a trend line? Is there anything about Alaska, what happened, that is worthwhile or alternatively fatal? If in fact the objective is at some point to end the war in Ukraine, or was it just a reflection, as you seem to suggest, of Trump and Putin? Anything new and serviceable out of Anchorage?
It depends on whose perspective you're, looking at this from. If you're looking at this from the perspective of Donald Trump and his, goal to, show that he can resolve, horrible conflicts around the world and, cruise towards a Nobel Peace Prize, this was not that kind of moment. If you are worried about the sort of deep sixing of US-Ukraine relations and Ukraine's relationship with Europe, it was another one of these near-death experiences, similar to what we had in the Oval Office,
right,
where Donald Trump seemed to embrace Putin's view that Ukraine should just hand over territory that it currently occupies, and that it could somehow come up with a new modus vivendi with Moscow. That is not, in my mind, something that's achievable. But if you have the United States leaning on Ukraine and leaning on the Europeans and using all of our power, it is something that might come to pass. I think the Europeans yet again showed that that would be bad for the United States. It would be bad for Europe, and sort of pulled Trump and Witkoff back from embracing a Russian version of how this war ends.
Right. And it's a good transition to Eric. Andrew described it as a near-death experience. Trying to detach myself and be as clinically and as brutally objective as possible. What happened yesterday in Washington seemed to be, certainly it wasn't February 28th catastrophe with Vance, Zelenskyy, and Trump. It seemed to be a little more substantive and coherent and balanced against what happened in Alaska. Is that a fair read, Eric?
I think that is a fair read. I mean, I think it's extraordinary that within 24 to 48 hours, you had not one, not two, but 7 European leaders drop everything they were doing and fly across the ocean to join with Zelenskyy and, press a unified cause to President Trump and the White House. And again, I give a lot of kudos to the Europeans for rearranging their August schedules to show this. And I think it's more than, just kind of the symbolism of it. It really does show that, for Trump, solving this war, it's not only about getting the two leaders into the room and dealing with Ukraine and Russia and their respective interests. This is a fundamental question of European security. And the fact that they all showed up yesterday, I think, is a testament to that. So I would say that, I'd give them high marks. I think Zelenskyy negotiated this diplomatic high wire very well. I think he learned a lot of lessons from February 28th. And so I watched very closely the scene in the Oval Office between the two of them yesterday. And Zelenskyy kept his answers crisp, and he stayed on message, and he didn't take the bait when different members of the press, I think, were trying to goad him into saying something that would inflame the situation. So good work all around there. On the substance, I think, the first takeaway from yesterday is that it flipped the script a bit from Anchorage, where in the lead up to, the Trump-Putin meeting, there was all this conversation, as Andrew was talking about territory and territorial swaps. And Steve Witkoff kept pressing the idea that ultimately it's only about these 5 regions of Ukraine and drawing a line and figuring out what the new map is going to look like. It's a real estate deal, and that's it. And I think what the Europeans, together with Zelenskyy, managed to show is that, no, actually, the fundamental question is about Ukraine's long-term security and making sure this doesn't happen again and figuring out the parameters of that. So they put the train from one track, which was, barreling towards a fundamental disagreement about territory, which is not going to be resolved anytime soon, to one that's much more productive, which is about the modalities of Ukraine's long-term security and relationship with the West. So from a kind of narrative and strategic perspective, I do think that the set of meetings yesterday was successful in doing that. Onto the substance. I think, as Andrew, hinted at, and hopefully we'll discuss today, when you dive into the details of these security arrangements, you end up having many more questions than answers. And there are still a lot of extremely opposing views of what call it security guarantee, security assurances, commitments, obligations. There's a lot of different language thrown out there, what this actually entails. And I think the fact that, you have the president going on Fox and Friends this morning and getting asked by the hosts, what do you mean when you say NATO Article 5 type security guarantee, but not taking them into NATO? And that's a very good question. And I think as Trump was kind of stumbling through the answer, and Europeans have been trying to explain themselves as well, because this is something that, Giorgia Meloni has been talking about, and different Europeans, we can do this security guarantee, but it's going to be something fundamentally different from and separate from NATO. The details are not quite there yet. And so I think we still have a long way to go on fleshing this out. It's encouraging that this meeting has launched what appears to be a more focused process of developing that, with Marco Rubio leading a conversation among national security advisors to flesh out the details. Again, in an ideal world, I think that should have happened before you get to the summitry. You do all the spade work and you do all the preparation at lower levels, and only once you're teed up with real decisions and options do you get the presidents involved. But in Trump world, it's the opposite. And he wanted to have the meeting first and, be in the room and try to knock heads together. And as Andrew was saying, it requires a lot more complex policy work before you get to that place where the ingredients are
right. I mean, I do want to talk about what's next, but I want to come back to first principles, because I think a negotiation, we can get away from summits. This is a negotiation to produce an agreement. And I want to come back, Andrew, to your understanding of whether or not on the issue of an agreement, let's humor me and let's say that we're not talking about a ceasefire. I mean, are Zelenskyy and Putin on different planets when it comes to the end states here? And to what degree does the end state the objectives of each side color what is possible in terms of trying to get there. What does Vladimir Putin want, Andrew?
So I wish I knew the answer. Nobody does, about where Putin's sort of irreducible minimum is. If Putin's irreducible minimum is full control of Ukraine, puppet regime, no European or Western independent security activities that aren't sort of under Moscow's supervision, no armed forces for Ukraine, except for something very token. If that's his irreducible minimum, and that they're brotherly nations, as he said in Anchorage, and that Ukraine's just a historical fiction, this war will go on for a very long time, because this is a genocidal war for Ukraine's very existence, and the people of Ukraine who've endured this for more than a decade aren't going to submit to those Russian, they're not maximalist demands. It's just a total negation of their existence, right? And there's plenty of blood now that validates that this isn't just talk or kind of hot, bravado on the part of the Russians. Like, they are actually working to grind Ukraine down and get those things, make that reality. If this is something that, as you say, is a negotiation, and I'm not persuaded that it is, I don't think we're anywhere near that. The Russians don't believe that the current course they're on won't lead to what I just described. I think they believe Ukraine may collapse. They believe that Western support could peter out. They believe that Donald Trump may, suborn Ukraine into some version of what I just described. So from their perspective, the more they just keep on keeping on, they may get this, accomplished. There is a version of this which is more negotiated, that people have been talking about and think tank people write about, and it requires a very complex set of arrangements and a kind of Russian recognition that the war path they're on will not pay off in the end. I haven't seen that light bulb go off in any Vladimir Putin's behavior. Like, based on his actions, he doesn't think he's going to fail here. He thinks he's on the pathway to success. And the U.S. being an inconstant, unpredictable, and kind of highly erratic supporter of Ukraine, feeds that confidence. I know I'm not answering your question, Aaron.
No,
I'm happy to do it on I'm happy to take it on and pretend that there's an arrangement here. Let me just sum up at the end. Like, if all this was, Ukraine's going to guarantee neutrality, Ukraine's going to swallow hard and accept that the current line of control is where things are going to, sort of land in terms of where Kiev's writ is. There won't be, further Russian territorial encroachment, that there will be some form of a robust Western security package for Ukraine that allows them to build a future military that's strong enough and that has a serious deterrent, as well as a Western commitment to provide reinforcements in the event of a new wave of Russian aggression at some point down the road after Russia rebuilds its conventional military. If there's, all these kinds of things are on offer, and the U.S. is foursquare behind it and is going to bankroll it or provide the equipment to make this real, and there's going to be serious European commitment to make this real, maybe that's where the thing lands. But I just don't think we're in that. We're not in that universe right now.
Yeah, Andrew, don't misunderstand. My question about negotiation is not to create a process without end. I know plenty of about that from the Middle East, where there's no real end state and no conviction on the part of any number of parties to get there. Why isn't what you laid out the theory of the case for Vladimir Putin? You believe, and I'll ask you directly, I'm assuming you do believe that is the theory of the case. That is, and there's nothing that would indicate from 2014 on that you're not reading Vladimir Putin accurately.
I believe that this is a war that people sort of sleepwalked into. This was not something that was foreordained, but that, as a result of a series of, big explosions and unexpected events, this was, this has become a conflagration that eludes really simple formulas for resolving. So if you look at why Putin found himself at war in Ukraine, there was a spontaneous popular uprising on the streets of Kyiv in 2014 after the government tried to put pressure on protesters and shot people in cold blood on the streets of Kyiv. And then the government sort of evaporated. A new state was built. Russia, to try to kind of keep its foot on the neck of Ukraine, seized Crimea and launched a covert war in the Donbass region. And things at some point kind of settled down. The United States and Europe tried to buy time for Ukraine. But after a while, Putin saw this kind of mushroom growing in Ukraine that had close ties, especially in the security realm, to the West, that was not going to lead to an easy reassertion of Russian domination over Ukraine, which is something Putin has tried a couple of times in the past, in 2004 and again in 2014, and it kept sort of escaping his grasp. So he decided in a very opportunistic way to go to war in early 2022, thinking he could pull this off and that Ukraine would collapse. And it almost did. I mean, he came very close to accomplishing this. And then he found himself sort of stuck in the worst case outcome, which is a war of attrition against Ukraine, in which now the people of Ukraine, for generations to come, are going to view Russia as a mortal threat. And they are not going to kind of surrender or, find a new modus vivendi with this enemy that they think is seeking to slaughter them in their beds. And they're not wrong about that, right? I mean, this is a reasonable person's conclusion based on everything we've seen over the past nearly 4 years of war. This is like as bad as it gets in terms of the sense of, Russia is out to destroy Ukraine and is happy to kill women and children and men and kidnap people and throw them in torture chambers to get it, right? I mean, there's nothing very complicated about all that.
Right. And last night's missile and drone barrage, which is one of the largest of the war, would suggest that. So, Eric, let me ask you, if Andrew's right about reading Putin correctly, what would be necessary in order to begin to change? You've done a lot of work on Ukrainian security and security guarantees and the U.S. side of this. What would be required to begin to change Putin's conception of what he wants in Ukraine?
Well, I think it depends in large part how far we collectively as the United States and Europe are willing to go. And I think it has been consistent between the previous administration and the current administration that the United States is not willing to send ground forces into Ukraine. President Trump reiterated that this morning, to sort of force some kind of military, end of hostilities. And so it does leave you with some pretty imperfect solutions. The best one I've seen so far is from our colleague, a non-resident scholar in our program and the former defense minister of Ukraine, Andrei Zagornyuk, where a couple of months ago, he published a piece with us which argued that, Ukraine and its partners need to stop assuming that they can do anything to really change Putin's calculus. Just take a base assumption that the war is going to continue or some form of armed standoff is going to continue in perpetuity. It may be at this level, it may be at this level, but there's never going to be some kind of formalized, agreed, stable peace. And so in those circumstances, what do you have to do in order to minimally defend yourself and negate Russia's ability to achieve any objectives on the battlefield? And he calls for, what he labels a series of functional defeats, where domain by domain in the military arena, air, land, sea, cyber, so on and so forth, you amass and deploy the capabilities needed to basically blunt Russia's ability to use its own tools in order to further its political objectives. And we saw that actually happen in the Black Sea, where Ukraine doesn't have a navy. Russia had a very powerful fleet based in Crimea, which its original objective was to blockade and then launch an amphibious assault against Odessa and seize the entire Ukrainian coastline. That proved impossible. And what Ukraine was able to do very methodically and systematically through innovation and help from external partners was, without a navy, with the use of very innovative undersea drone warfare, essentially push the Russian Black Sea fleet out of the Western Black Sea and back to the Russian coast. And so at this point, the naval war has reached a point where Russia can't really deploy its assets in any meaningful way against Ukraine. So what Andrei talks about is using these building blocks to get to a point of strategic neutralization. That's the term he uses, where basically Russia keeps waging war. It doesn't forswear its objectives. It never agrees to any peace, but it keeps banging its head against a wall and it doesn't achieve anything.
Yep.
And I think that's probably the best case scenario we can hope for, because I think changing Vladimir Putin's calculus under the current scenario with the current level of Western political will is just not in the cards.
Yeah. And if you added to that economic pressure, I don't know where the Europeans are on the billions of frozen Russian assets and why that wouldn't be used to fund Ukraine. I don't know where Trump is on the issue of how much military equipment he's prepared to allow the Europeans to buy. You could create a package of elements toward this sort of, what did you call it? Strategic neutralization. Because right now it seems to me, and I want to move now to back to Trump. Strategic neutralization seems to me to be the clearest way forward. If Andrew is right, and I see no reason to doubt what he's saying about Putin's calculations, no empirical evidence to suggest anything other than that. And your insightful comments about building on what Andrei said, that strikes me as a strategy tethered to not to a galaxy far, far away, but to the realities back here on planet Earth. One additional point before we get to the next two phases, according to the Trump plan. I think the University of Chicago, in conjunction with Uppsala in Sweden, analyzed every interstate, not interstate, but interstate conflict since 1815. The average length of an interstate conflict since 1815 is 3 months. Once a conflict goes to a year, 18 months, 2 years, it's most likely to last a decade. You're now, 2022, it's now 2025. We're looking at this conflict continuing well into this year and probably into next, if the two of you are correct. So here's my question. You now have two procedural aspirational breakthroughs planned. The first is a Putin-Zelenskyy meeting, and the second is a trilateral. I cannot, as a non-expert in these matters, but someone who knows a little about negotiations, understand what the purpose. Let's take the first one, Andrew. What is the purpose of a Putin-Zelenskyy meeting under the circumstances that we've laid out? Just one additional point. And is this a problem for Zelenskyy? I mean, to shake the hand of the bloodied hand of Vladimir Putin while he launches drone and missile strikes against Ukrainian civilians with no guarantee whatsoever that bilateral would produce anything? I don't understand this. So maybe
you're thinking too hard about it. So let me, at the risk of being glib, just kind of tell you what's going on here. Ever since that horrible meeting in the Oval Office, the Ukrainians have been working as best they can to avoid being blamed for the diplomatic gambit not succeeding. And
Right.
they have worked very closely with the Europeans to kind of be portraying themselves as big supporters of the gambit, wanting to, help Donald Trump win the Nobel Peace Prize, like all that stuff, and being super grateful for the incredible leadership of the United States, both in trying Putin, testing his willingness to pursue a peace agreement, as well as to keep Ukraine afloat. Great gratitude to the United States for all their support. And they've done that, I think, quite effectively. And so earlier in this saga, the president also once previously said there needed to be a leaders meeting, and let's do it in Istanbul, and let's get Zelenskyy together with Putin. And Zelenskyy was the first to say, I'm getting on the next plane. I will be there. I can't, I couldn't help but want to be there. And so that's what we're witnessing again, is a sort of gambit to show that it's Vladimir Putin who doesn't want peace, and that, that the Russians are going to put, pile on conditions as a prerequisite for any meeting between Zelenskyy and Putin. The reality is Putin won't meet Zelenskyy unless he's there to surrender to Russia. And so I think this is an elegant way of once again showing that there's no receptivity in Moscow for a serious effort to make peace with Ukraine, unless it's on Russia's terms. And that's just at this point not going to happen. Ukraine is not on its knees, and it's not desperate. They're worried. They're really, things are not looking good, but they would, I'm borrowing one of Eric's phrases here, they would rather kind of just keep going, even if the long-term picture is not very encouraging, than settle at the current moment. So that's sort of the gambit that they're willing to pursue. One of the things that Trump heard from Putin in Anchorage was, I'm going to get all this stuff I want anyways, so why not give it to me now and avoid the loss of life that's likely to result in the interim? And that has been one of Russia's most persuasive messages to this administration. And I think, Ukraine's friends in the West need to hear that, and, really ponder what we can do, as Eric was saying, that makes Russia start to, question that calculus. Because right now it's a very persuasive calculus, I think, if you look just objectively at the way the war is going.
So the bilateral meeting is a gotcha game?
I wouldn't say it's a gotcha game, but I think it's a kind of saying, like, we need to test the Russians. And so the first test of their sincerity would be, let's get a bilateral meeting going between Putin and Zelenskyy so that the dialogue is initiated. And then we can see, are the Russians serious? And if they're throwing out things like they did today, and I don't know if you've seen it, but today, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov insisted that unless Zelenskyy cancels various laws that Russia claims are discriminating against the rights of Russophone populations inside Ukraine, like, we can't deal with him. So again, the Russians are not eager to see Zelenskyy. And yesterday's announcement, I think, just will once again demonstrate that is, abundantly the case.
But they might come.
No, I think it's very low. I mean, I'm wrong about everything, Aaron, but I'm really skeptical that Putin will meet with Zelenskyy anytime soon. Yeah. And German Chancellor Merz is saying this needs to happen in the next 10 to 12 days, I think was the time frame he specified. I find that it's unthinkable.
I'd ask each of you what would have to happen in order to have a productive Zelenskyy Putin meeting, but I think we more or less have answered the question. In the next 10 days, there's nothing that can be done. They're going to fundamentally change the calculation. Eric, to you on Zelenskyy, there's no domestic problem for him sitting down with the architect of this Ukrainian slaughter and achieving nothing because he needs to please Trump, and Trump becomes more important than the blowback that Zelenskyy might get from such a meeting that doesn't produce a ceasefire or an end to the violence or anything that he can show for it?
I think Ukrainians have become very sophisticated observers of the international game over the past 3.5 years, and are quite cynical about the motivations of different partners. And I think they've come to understand that, the United States under Trump is putting enormous pressure on Ukraine, and that their president needs to find a way to not be the obstacle and creatively maneuver around these, different pitfalls. And so I think they give him quite a lot of breathing space to pursue what Zelenskyy argues is necessary in the international domain. So I think they would, Ukrainians would by and large understand why he's doing a trilateral or a bilateral. Obviously, the optics, whatever comes out of it, if there is a handshake or something like that, the Russians and propaganda will play all of it up and try to undermine him. But I do think, Ukrainians, even those who dislike Zelenskyy politically, when, at the water's edge really means something in Ukraine. Yeah. When he goes overseas, he represents the state. They support the state. They give him a lot of leeway to do what he thinks is necessary. And even when you had that disastrous Oval Office meeting in February, there was a rallying around the flag. And I think they think he performed well over the weekend under, yesterday under very difficult circumstances. So I don't think it's a political issue for him. But I agree with Andrew that it's, nothing is likely to come out, even in the very unlikely scenario that Putin shows up for this. I don't understand what the two leaders could achieve at the leadership level, or even in some trilateral format, which I think is dangerous for Ukraine because I don't think Trump is, a neutral party.
Right. Well, I want to get that in a minute, but Eric, you indicated to me that you were sort of maybe surprised that the issue of security guarantees, people were actually talking about it in something that represented a coherent fashion. Can you unpack that?
I mean, coherent is probably an overstatement in this case, but at least consistently talking about it and the words coming out of Trump's mouth is surprising to me. I think the problem is that everyone has a different understanding of what a security guarantee, or in this particular case, what they would mean for Ukraine. And so you've heard this very strange formulation, which started with the Italian prime minister, and then you had Steve Witkoff saying it over the weekend, and even Trump yesterday, something like Article 5 that isn't Article 5, and when pressed, would not involve the direct intervention by the parties. So I've been trying to puzzle through what that could actually mean, because Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, while it is, vaguely worded because it's a, 2-page treaty document, has a very clear understanding that has been created through 70 plus years of really close alliance work. And that clear understanding is, if the territory of a NATO ally is attacked, all the other ones will come to its defense. How is that more than just words on a paper? It's because there's constant meetings from the leadership level, ministers down to the staff levels. There's contingency plans. They are elaborated contingency plans. There is a process of military coordination. They have deployed together in Afghanistan and elsewhere. I mean, there is a very clear understanding that NATO would operate together as a military alliance to defend any ally.
Right.
So if you take that part away from it, what is left? I don't understand. I mean, not to be silly, but this reminds me of my little sister when she was a toddler, and she would ask for a hot dog without the red thing in it. And, bread is nice, bread is good, but if you don't have the hot dog in it, it's not a hot dog anymore. And so Article 5, without a commitment of U.S. military intervention or the intervention of these European military powers, I fundamentally don't understand what it is. So I hope that Marco Rubio and the other European national security advisors, when they get together, can really hammer out what this is. We've gotten some more hints. I mean, Trump was a little bit more explicit this morning in the Fox and Friends appearance, where he said no American ground troops, but maybe some air component. So then what are we talking about? I mean, if we take this all at face value, which I agree with Andrew that this may still all be totally performative and theoretical, but let's just assume for a second that this is serious. So could you envision some kind of European military contingent that has some kind of training mission and reassurance mission. Again, they've been talking about this for months, but let's say it goes into Ukraine and the US military provides some amount of air cover and enablers, intelligence support, logistics, so on and so forth. I mean, it's thinkable how you get to some sort of answer on that. It's not a security guarantee in any classical sense. It's something else, maybe ceasefire monitoring or something like that. I'm not entirely sure. If you package it with some kind of long-term predictable supply to the Ukrainians of weapons to help them build the army that they're going to need to defend and deter, yeah, you start to get into something that is concretely, getting to a place where you do establish some sort of deterrence with the Russians and they understand that there's a cost to reinvading. Again, it doesn't look like a classical security guarantee, and I wish people would not use that word because it kind of cheapens our other security guarantees, which are enshrined in treaties. That's
Right.
another point. We haven't talked about Congress and all of this. I mean, if the president is prepared to give another country something that is tantamount to pledging that we will be a party to the war in the future, that needs to go through Congress, I think. And, we haven't talked about that. And you've seen a couple of senators come out and say that. I read a statement by Michael Bennet yesterday, which was really, incisive, saying, basically, this is great if we're moving in the direction of talking about Ukraine's long-term security. But if the president is going to make a long-term commitment that implicates future funding that Congress is going to provide and puts military requirements on the table that a future U.S. administration is going to have to fulfill in order to, maintain U.S. credibility, that needs to go through a regular, advice and consent process. And I think he's 100% right about that. And that hasn't even entered the conversation.
Right. I might add that we haven't provided such a guarantee since the revision of the 1960 U.S.-Japan treaty. That's a huge lift. Andrew, please.
I just want to say that the enemy always gets a vote, right? And so everything Eric says is great, desirable. It may be the only pathway to, prevent a Russian reattack somewhere down the road. But the Russians have been very, very explicit that Ukraine's not going to have Western troops on its territory, that it's not going to have continued Western military and intelligence cooperation, and that it's going to become this pygmy. And that's what they're arguing, and they've shown no give on those things. So, the idea that Vladimir Putin may have said something that was misinterpreted in Anchorage, and then people ran around saying, look, this is a new Russian concession. That's all totally unfounded. What the Russians have put on the table is that there would be these security guarantors. It would look something sort of like UN Security Council Plus, and that Russia would be among those guarantors, and it would retain a Russian veto in terms of what kind of response is mounted in the event of a new crisis. It's not a serious security guarantee. It's a Russian ploy to retain control over Ukraine.
Right. And we haven't even talked about what the quid pro quo would be for Russians even entertaining any sort of meaningful security guarantee. And that gets down, Andrew, I think, to the issue of territory, correct?
I'm sorry, Aaron, this is not Area B, Area C kind of stuff. This is not about territory. And, Vladimir Putin wants a puppet regime in Kyiv that does not have intelligence and military cooperation with the West, is not receiving massive pipeline of security assistance to, rebuild its military. It doesn't want any of that stuff. And, I am sorry, but if this were, just a question of, can I have Donbass and I'll give you the line of control in Zaporizhia and Kherson, which is the notional offer on the table. But that's just not what this is. He wants Ukraine to collapse and fall back into Russia's embrace.
Right. Eric, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we look back at the negotiations that did happen early in the war in Istanbul, which Andrew has referenced, and we kind of see the terms of that quid pro quo, which was we agreed to this cockamamie P5 security guarantee formulation, which Russia was demanding a veto over, again, which is absurd. So if Ukraine is attacked passively by whom? Russia in the future, then Russia would be able to block some sort of response. Totally ridiculous. But that was the offer on the table in exchange for Ukraine agreeing to a very severe form of military neutrality. And I want to disabuse listeners of the notion that this offer on the table, such as it was something like, Swedish or Finnish or Swiss kind of non-alignment and neutrality, where they were able to have their own,
Right.
Armies and credible defense and deterrence, but they just weren't part of any alliance. No, what Russia was demanding here was a neutralization of Ukraine, a complete severance of all of its security relationships with partners, an army that, like Andrew was saying, would be a token force that would be run over in the first second of a new invasion. And again, it wasn't about installing a puppet regime or anything like that very explicitly, but it was about creating the circumstances where Ukraine would be so weak that Russia could coerce it into doing whatever it wanted in the future.
Right.
And so that, to me, is not a reasonable quid pro quo.
Yeah.
And I think until, like Andrew has been saying, until the Russian leadership realizes that these more sweeping objectives are simply impossible, and I have no idea what it will take to get that through Putin's head, then you don't have a deal.
Right. Last question. We're over the time, but on vacay, I've been watching a lot of Seinfeld reruns. And actually, I've watched them many times. But the one that comes to mind, and again, when you have an American president, the president of the United States, sit down with Vladimir Putin, and then you have the head of the EU, head of NATO, the Brits, the French, the Germans show up in Washington for a meeting, and you're talking about the possibility of a bilateral and a trilateral. It must be serious. I keep thinking to myself, it must be serious. But then I fall back on George and Jerry, or George's brilliant notion of producing the show about nothing. And I want to thank the two of you, because a lot of what I've watched as a non-expert the last 3 days has been tethered to a galaxy far, far away. And what the two of you have done, I think, without predisposing this as complete and utter failure, is to ground this in the realities that we're facing back here on planet Earth. And that, frankly, I guarantee you, none of Donald Trump's advisors are telling him this. I hope the Europeans may not be telling him this either. And Zelenskyy, for all the reasons Eric says, may have been pulling his punches. So I don't know where we are. I don't understand the bilateral or the trilateral, what it is designed to do without changing Putin's calculations, an extraordinary lot of homework and pressure to try to make these meetings successful. Parting last word, Andrew, Eric?
Just real quick, I'm not sure I buy the Seinfeld thing. This is all deadly serious. And the Russians have been hoping that they could plant, a big wedge between the United States and Europe, United States and Ukraine. He was largely successful in doing that with the proposal he gave to Steve Witkoff a little under 2 weeks ago. So, there are real serious ripple effects of all of this. There has been, I think, a very uneasy new equilibrium created between the United States and Europe over who's going to do the heavy lifting on supporting Ukraine. And it requires a level of U.S. cooperation down in the bureaucracy of the Pentagon and other parts of our system to actually, make the new underwriting by Europe of Ukraine's security needs and the military equipment they need an effective mechanism. This is all new stuff. The government has been largely hollowed out over the past 6 months of the kind of expertise that's required to implement those kinds of arrangements. And then lastly, it's a war. And it's really dynamic. And The president was reminded at the most recent juncture of the Ukrainian special operation to attack Russian strategic air assets, Operation Spiderweb, that Ukraine has cards here. And Ukraine is not just kind of, it's not going well for them. Like but the Russians are not rolling over Ukraine right now. And so there's just a lot of, I think, need here for real understanding about what a grinding war here means, why it's not good for Ukraine, and why even if the current policy that Eric and I see taking shape before Anchorage is implemented, it still may not be enough to save, Ukraine from an ultimate, moment where the Russians really are poised to deal them in the Biden administration's terminology, a strategic defeat. Like that is still a very real policy problem, and we should not, pretend that sort of just fending off Donald Trump's diplomatic forays is going to prevent that outcome from occurring. Over.
Right, but the most likely outcome is that the war continues. It's that the war continues, correct?
It's a war. It's continuing. That's not going well for the West and for Ukraine first and foremost.
Yeah,
and that's a real policy problem. That's not something we can just hand wave.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Eric, a final note.
I mean, I would just, one final note there. I agree with Andrew. This is all deadly serious. And I won't be one to criticize, President Trump for using his own personal sort of energies to wade into this. I think diplomacy is good and necessary, and keeping the focus on what the Russians are doing and how we figure this out, I think it is needed. And I think Alaska, even though there were some images that made me uncomfortable and it was definitely premature, on the whole, probably not, the worst idea for there to be leader level contacts between the United States and Russia. I believe that Trump has the recipe and the ingredients in his pantry to actually shift what is, as Andrew describes, a war that is not going well for our interests or for Ukraine's future into something that is more sustainable and has the chance of not ending disastrously for European security. The problem is that, the recipe is lost somewhere, and he doesn't seem to be doing much work to figure out the right quantities and the right order in which you do this. And so I hope that in the coming weeks, there will be a little bit of reflection at the lower levels in the administration to say, okay, we now have everyone's attention. Everyone is focused on us now, and we have a huge amount of sway with all of the parties. That's definitely true. The United States has tremendous sway with everyone involved here. Now we need to organize our work in a way that makes sense so that we actually nail down some of these details and then bring it back to leaders. Yeah. And I think with that, I do have a little bit of hope that we could end up in a better place than we are right now. But I think firing in a bunch of different directions and just kind of hoping that people get in a room and, just shake hands and everything magically goes away is fantasy.
Well, for Ukraine's sake and for ours, let's hope, Andrew and Eric, that Trump finds that recipe. Thank the two of you again, as always. A masterclass in honesty and clarity, and greatly appreciated.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks so much.